Something is happening in the South. While our media pay almost no attention to it, the balance of world relations is tilting. It was only a matter of time, but in May 2023, it happened. For the first time in centuries, the share of the global South in the world economy is greater than that of the countries of the North. The era in which Washington, London, Paris and Berlin decide, and the rest of the world just has to nod, is over. Countries of the South are straightening their backs and claiming their place at the world table. In Washington, they call it mutiny. Mutiny means that the United States can no longer simply impose its will. I'm invited to the conference of the International People's Assembly in Johannesburg. Here, hundreds of movements from all over the world come together to speak about solidarity, justice, bread, and peace. It's overwhelming. Not only do I hear the stories, the testimonies and analyses, but I also feel the solidarity. It's mind and soul. Poetry, song and dance are prominently featured. I'm listening to Azania, the passionate anti-apartheid song. While the sounds are still reverberating, I meet Vijay Prashad, Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay is from India. He's my age, and as a historian, he has tons of experience about the movements in the South. Vijay has an analytical mind. He knows how to explain things crystal clear. The connection between the movements in the North and the South, that's what this is about. He starts his story in Europe, and in particular with the war in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine has been an accelerated lesson for a lot of countries. Well, in fact, it wasn't the war in Ukraine itself that accelerated things. It's what the West was trying to do that accelerated things. So, okay, there's a conflict going on in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is a country in Europe. What does it have to do with South Africa? People can say a lot of grain comes from Ukraine, Russia and so on, and it impacted world food markets. That's true, it's related, globalization and so on. But it's a European conflict. And yet, United States, the Germans, the British, the French, they started going around the world to countries like South Africa, India, Brazil, big countries, and telling them, you must adopt our view of what's happening in Ukraine. Why are you not condemning Russia and so on? At which point these countries started to say, hey, listen, number one, it's not our conflict, it's your conflict. The Prime Minister of Namibia said, there are wars in Africa, you don't take a position on them. Why should we take a position on the war in Europe?
Sevim told me the same thing. Western countries apply double standards. That is painfully topical today. It's apparent in the reaction of certain Western countries to Israel's war of destruction against Palestine. After Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, an economic and military embargo was immediately declared, and an international arrest warrant for Putin quickly followed. But now it's quiet. It's not the West, but South Africa that is standing up against the genocide that Israel is carrying out on Palestine. South Africa, as a country of the South, is taking Israel to the International Court of Justice in The Hague with a complaint against the Genocide Act. It's an impressive, strong, and necessary response to the heinous crimes of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm there when South Africa's leaders are making history. Why doesn't the West support that charge? Why is there no economic and military embargo against the colonizing state of Israel? In the South, these double standards have long been seen through. They're more than fed up with this hypocrisy.
So it's not exactly the war, but it was the West's attempt to push its view of the war on these countries that made them all say we're not interested. And fascinatingly, I think the West miscalculated on this. United States tried at the G20, the group of 20 meetings, but the United States tried to use the G20 to push a resolution on Russia. And initially there was hesitation. Then at the G20 meeting in Indonesia, and this is key, G20 meeting in Indonesia, not in the Western countries, the Indonesians fought to say, and Indonesia is not a left-wing government, okay, it's quite a right-wing government. They fought to say, look, the question of the war in Ukraine, it's not for us. We want to discuss development. And they made the West back off a little bit. Then the next meeting was in Delhi. That was this year. In Delhi, again, there was a real push that the question of Ukraine be taken up. United States pushed this hard. Then the Indians said it's not on the agenda. We are a development meeting.
The G20, or Group of 20, is the collection of 20 major economies in the world. This includes the large, rich Western countries, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy. But the G20 also includes the emerging economies of the South, such as Brazil, India, and South Africa. Within the G20, there's a struggle. The United States are trying to dictate their law, but recently they've hit a wall there. For the first time in a long time, the countries of the South have said no. They don't want to be pushed around any longer. They want to talk about what is important to them as well and try to argue against them.
It's a really good illustration of how the South is saying we have our own agenda. And my gosh, Peter, for the first time in years, the South is saying our agenda should define the world's agenda.
The struggle of the South to chart its own course is not new. It wasn't so long ago that those same countries had to fight against colonization. Great Britain controlled India and Egypt. The French controlled West Africa and Vietnam. The Netherlands ruled Indonesia. The Portuguese controlled Brazil, and the Belgians brutalized the Congo. The Western countries did the same thing everywhere, sucking out the wealth and resources from a country. Vijay reminds us of what colonization meant for the people in the South.
Well, there's a couple of things that are really important. One is that, there's an amnesia in many parts of the West in particular about colonialism. People don't really know what colonialism was. Children aren't taught in schools the actual facts of colonialism. Let me just give you one fact. Britain ruled over India. Britain is a tiny little island. How it could rule such a huge part of the world, some say a quarter of the world, is unbelievable. But they ruled all of India. 300 years they were in India. When the British were kicked out of India, the literacy rate in India was 12%. 12%. And yet the language was, we came to civilize the barbarian. The French talk of mission civilization. Really, what did you civilize? Literacy rates were really low. So point one, right after these countries became independent, was we need to develop. That was point one. Many of them met in Bandung, Indonesia, 1955. They created the African Asian Conference. They met to discuss the development agenda.
The colonies claimed their independence, and despite cruel repression by colonial troops, dozens of countries became independent in the 1950s and 1960s. When the countries were finally free of colonization, a new challenge awaited. They may have become politically independent, but not economically. Economically, they were still dependent on skewed world relations. And to do something about that, those countries decided to put their heads together and united. They met on the Indonesian island of Java in the city of Bandung. And that turned out to be a historic meeting. In Bandung, the stones were laid for the Third World Project. The Third World Project is a platform of non-aligned countries that were looking for an alternative to the bipolar world. On one side was the First World with capitalism, and on the other side was the Second World with socialism. The Third World was not a place, but a message. We no longer want to tie ourselves to one partner. We do not want to take sides in the arms race between superpowers. we want to come up with an alternative and we want peace.
They said, look, we don't want to waste our precious wealth, whatever little wealth we have, extremely poor countries, we don't want to waste our precious wealth on the arms race. We don't want to get involved in the war between the United States and the Western countries, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the USSR. We don't want that because that's a waste. We don't want to get caught up with military bases of the US or whatever. So we want development and we don't want your war. These were the 2 points. In 1961, most of the countries that were freed from colonialism, including Yugoslavia, came to Belgrade in Yugoslavia and they launched the non-aligned movement, which meant that we don't want to be involved, peace is our agenda, in the war between the West and the East. We don't want this war. And development is our agenda.
That longing for freedom in the South of today has its roots in the Third World Project. That project was one big demand for social justice, bread and peace. Not everyone was happy. Western superpowers in the G7 tried to sabotage this call, and they used debt as a weapon. It went like this. When those colonies had won their independence, those countries inherited a country without state structures or without real social services. And so those countries needed money, a lot of money to invest, and they started turning to international creditors, such as the International Monetary Fund. And that monetary fund, the IMF, did lend money, but with those loans also came terrible conditions. For example, public wealth had to be privatized. For example, the markets had to be opened up and the debt had to be repaid in dollars. But then again, how do you get dollars? By export. The countries were forced to grow crops for export. That was the only way to get hard dollars and pay off the debts. The debt burden of South American, Caribbean and African countries increased very quickly. And then in 1979, interest rates were raised drastically. A catastrophe.
The United States government lifted the interest rates in 1979. It's called the Volcker shock. When they lifted the interest rates, suddenly countries which had borrowed money in dollars found the dollars much more expensive and they had to pay more to service their debt. So they went into a debt crisis. The moment you begin to be beholden to creditors, to wealthy bondholders overseas, your space of maneuver decreases. Because now, if you try to do something radical, the bondholders will squeeze you.
The fact that commodity prices also plummeted in the 1980s was too much for many countries. At the time, Mexico was the first country that couldn't pay off its debts, but many other countries would follow. And that debt crisis caused the International Monetary Fund to take an increasingly aggressive stance. After all, it was the only institution that still provided loans to countries with overdue payments. And that IMF could therefore impose any conditions for new loans. And it did. And many countries have paid dearly for that. In order to obtain credit, dozens of countries were forced to put their health, education and public wealth on the line and open up their local economies to multinationals from the north. The countries of the south have been put on the spot for a very long time.
The coup in Chile, the Soviets couldn't protect the government of Salvador Allende, but they did protect other governments, around the world. And also, of course, they provided a shield for Cuba, at the time essential. So the decline of the Soviet Union and then its collapse and then the debt crisis really constrained the political options for the newly independent countries. That weakened the NAM. And from a weak NAM in the 90s till now, maybe a year or so ago, the South has really been in a position of desperation.
But while the world is changing, some people's minds remain stagnant. You just have to listen to someone like Josep Borrell, the Chief of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. His use of language stems straight from British colonialism.
Europe is a garden we have built a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden.
With these words, he wants to encourage a new generation of diplomats to carry out their diplomatic work in the South. But according to Mr. Borrell, the South is a wilderness, a jungle, and the North is a neat garden. It's therefore logical that dozens of countries are reacting negatively, and in the European Parliament, Mark Botenga is asking for that statement to be put on the agenda.
What's the difference between a garden and a jungle? A garden's a nice place where civilized human beings walk around. A jungle is the heart of darkness, where wild animals live. Now, many people in Africa, Asia, Latin America remember very well how in the name of civilization, European colonialism treated them like wild animals, enslaving them, torturing them, and even exhibiting them in human zoos. Therefore, when the highest diplomat of the European Union compares Europe to a garden, but especially the rest of the world to a jungle, the message these people hear is that Europe is still driven by neocolonialism. We cannot let that message pass.
For some leaders of the old world, it's difficult to grasp that new world changes are coming. There's a neo-colonial mouse in their head, and it just won't get out. The countries of the South know that they have to come up with their own ideas for their own development.
Look, we've run out of ideas. All the old development plans not working. You know, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, none of them are working. We need new ideas.
My friendly guide Noel drives me through Johannesburg. Noel works for the South African metal union NUMSA. While he passionately talks about rugby, I talk about football. We drive through town and he brings me to the building where the BRICS gathered in August of 2023. The BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, the 5 major emerging countries from the South, which came together after the banking crisis in 2008 to look for an alternative to the international financial system.
Everything changed with the financial crisis of 2007. You have this crisis in 2007, banking crisis around the world, and then the countries of the South say, hey, wait a minute, we are relying too much on markets in the North. The United States is no longer going to be the market of last resort. They're not going to buy all our goods and services. We need to start selling to each other. The idea starts South-South cooperation, South-South markets and so on.
So what you're saying is that also the BRICS and the South-South cooperation is also a reaction on the banking crisis of 2008.
The financial crisis of 2008 was a shock to large emerging countries such as India and China because they were also dependent on Western growth. And when Wall Street's financial system suddenly collapsed, it became clear that the economy of the United States will not always be the last resort. The crisis had ended the credibility of Western financial institutions. And in response, countries of the South are coming together to find alternatives to Wall Street, to develop South-South trade and to forge more mutual relationships.
In this period, when we think about the BRICS countries, these countries can trade with each other. You know, they don't really need the Western markets. So, for instance, you know, the Chinese developed the Belt and Road Initiative. One reason they developed that in 2013, first called One Belt, One Road, was to break away from the US market, to find new markets. You know, the Chinese also have practical things that they require. And so they created new market opportunities in Central Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and then in Europe. I mean, 17 countries joined the Belt and Road Initiative because they saw that there were benefits for everybody. And so now things are different. Look, if you're a country anywhere in the world, if you're any country in the world, and you're put a choice, 2 ambassadors come before you, US ambassador and Chinese ambassador. Chinese ambassador says, look, you know, we have these private companies, they want to invest. People's Bank of China can give you a currency swap. We can build you a road. We'll also build you a hospital and so on. And the US government comes and says, look, we want the right to land our bombers in your country. We want you to take a loan from the IMF and go deeper into debt. And we want you to make sure that our multinational companies are the only ones to exploit your minds. If you're given a choice like that, what are you going to pick? You'd have to be an idiot to pick the US choice. You'd pick the Chinese choice. And I think this is what the West is not able to grapple with. They're not understanding that people aren't selecting to trade with the Chinese because the Chinese have some plot. The Chinese are putting a better deal on the table.
It's just a better deal. Western leaders can't hide that, no matter how hard they try.
I would like to say to Biden, I would like to say to Sunak and others, you keep talking about free markets, but you don't allow countries to make their own deals. You want to impose this thing on them, saying that no, the Chinese are spying on you. Chinese are spying on you. Look at Germany. So ridiculous. Germany had a debate about we should ban Huawei because they might spy on us. Meanwhile, you already have evidence from Edward Snowden that the US was not only spying on Germany, they were spying on Angela Merkel's cell phone, the Chancellor's cell phone, and yet you don't have any fear of the US. I mean, this is how ideology works.
Washington uses an increasingly hostile rhetoric against the emerging countries from the South. In the 1960s, the US succeeded in suppressing the non-aligned movement through the burden of debt. Today, the situation is completely different because the emerging countries of the BRICS are much stronger, economically stronger than the third world countries at the time. Today, China has become a fully fledged global player, and that worries Washington. Washington has declared an economic war on China and is demanding that the rest of the world take sides.
The West can't understand that countries in the South are not being duped by the Chinese or they've not misunderstood the West. They very well understand what are the two choices before them. Now the tragedy is, why should countries choose? Why can't they trade with everybody? And so the new mood in the South isn't again to line up with the Chinese or the Russians against the West. The new mood in the South is we want development and we want to stay out of these conflicts. We want to trade with everybody. And so it's actually a mirror ideologically of the non-aligned movement. Even though the context is different, it's a mirror, but it's a mirror that cannot be read in New York or in London or, dare I say, in Brussels. People don't grasp this. It's the intelligence of the people of Africa, the intelligence of the Asians, intelligence of Latin America. For God's sake, it's the intelligence of the Europeans who would like these deals, instead of austerity, instead of having to monitor how much heat they have in their house. I mean, how ridiculous it is that now Europeans, Europe, one looked up to Europe's basic middle-class civilization. Europeans now have to watch, I'm going to put my heat off because I can't pay the bills. It's a scandal. What has Europe done to its own civilization?
Politically, these BRICS countries are very different from each other. But when it comes to trade, they can work together. They are, in other words, very, very pragmatic. What unites these BRICS countries in all their diversity is their will to be able to formulate their own policies based on their own national interests.
So the BRICS is the symptom of a new opening in the world, a new mood. And of course, these countries have such different political orientations. The BRICS itself is not a socialist development, but it might be useful for socialism. It itself isn't opening the door to a left project. It's not opening the door to greater democracy or anything, but it might help us fight on the ground to build space.
In 1768, the sailors in Sunderland lowered their sails. It was mutiny. In the global South, the current mutiny has a double character: above deck and below deck. What do I mean by that? Many governments want to make their own decisions about their resources, their wealth, and their development. And that is the mutiny above deck, where governments clash with the prevailing world relations. But there's also a lot of protest within those countries, and rightly so. There are popular movements that are trying to impose their own agenda, a progressive agenda, whether it's land reform, good wages, strong public services, democratic rights. That's the mutiny below deck, from the bottom up, so to speak. In India, for example, the right-wing President Modi wanted to liberalize the whole of agriculture. But that was without counting on the farmers. They united all over India, which is huge, and they fought for 388 days. That's more than a year. In November 2020, there were strikes with 250 million participants. That's half of the working class in India. Enormous, unheard of. And in the end, the right-wing Indian government had to give in and withdraw its decision. That urge for freedom can be seen everywhere. There's the struggle of the metalworkers union NUMSA in South Africa. There's the struggle of the movement of landless workers in Brazil. There's the struggle of the women's movement, a huge women's movement in India, and so on. All these struggles deserve our support. In the end, the social movements in the South and those in the North are waging the same struggle against the same global order, the same monopolies, and the same system of exploitation. And that battle goes up and down.
History doesn't move in a straight line. History moves in zigs and zags. There are advances, there are retreats. There are advances, there are retreats. Why this is important, especially for young people, that young people must learn the actual path of history. Because if you believe that everything improves and you have a setback, then it's catastrophic. You feel, my God, why did I build this big struggle? We had a defeat. But every defeat is the start of a new victory. As we advance, we will get hit because we know that we are challenging power frontally. We are challenging imperialism frontally. But many years ago, I read a great line which said that if you're afraid to fail, you won't do anything. If you are on the left, we have to be willing to experiment, to do things, to make mistakes, to fail. And then we stand up and we run again. So the attitude is, yes, this is a turning point.
A turning point, Vijay says, and during my stay in South Africa, the world keeps tilting. The war in Palestine enters a new phase of ruthless violence, and those first images of bombing of hospitals reach the conference in Johannesburg. Many people walk away, and so do I, because I can't bear to see it. I have no words for this abomination. Fortunately, there was an immediate response also here in Johannesburg. People come out on the streets and make themselves heard.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
And it doesn't stop there, because a few months later, South Africa's lawsuit against Israel followed. That can count for some symbolism, because not so long ago, South Africa was an apartheid state, a state of injustice. And now that same South Africa is fighting against injustice and against Israel's apartheid. How's that for a tipping point? Protests are increasing in the entire world. A whole new generation is standing in solidarity with Palestine, but the feeling goes much deeper. From Jakarta to Brussels, from London to Johannesburg, from Istanbul to Washington, millions of people are taking to the streets for peace, for bread, for justice. I return home with hope and perspective, and I realize that however many miles of sea and land may lie between us, we are so incredibly connected. I'm convinced that together we can tilt things together, even if we encounter resistance. They call it mutiny when workers unite to stand up for decent wages and working conditions, or when social action is rising for democratic rights or for our climate. They call it mutiny that countries and peoples want to decide for themselves about their resources and claim the right to process their resources themselves. They call it mutiny that countries and people refuse to take sides in a trade war and a new Cold War that is forced upon them by Washington. They call it mutiny that the unipolar era of the United States is gradually coming to an end. Well, if that's all mutiny, then let's embrace that mutiny, because it's the right course of history.